The after-action report sits in the National Archives, and it says what it says. June 25, 1944. Trieste Harbor. One German destroyer, sunk. Ordnance expended, 50 caliber ammunition. Bombs dropped, 0. Rockets fired, 0. The vessel went to the bottom of the Adriatic killed by machine gun bullets, and the pilots who put it there belonged to the 332nd Fighter Group. How does that work? A destroyer displaces over 1,000 tons. It carries armor plate, watertight compartments, anti-aircraft guns crewed by men whose entire job is to kill strafing aircraft. The 50 caliber M2 Browning fires a bullet that weighs roughly 1.8 ounces. You do not sink warships with rifle caliber thinking, except someone did. So either the report is wrong, or something happened off the coast of Italy that the Kriegsmarine would rather not explain. The pilots flying that mission were Black Americans, men the United States Army Air Forces had spent years trying not to train, then trying not to deploy, then trying to bury in secondary assignments where they couldn't embarrass anyone's thesis about racial inferiority. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. By June of 1944, they'd been in theater for months, flying out of Italian airfields, and they'd recently transitioned from P-39 Airacobras to P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, and could put out roughly 50 rounds per second when all 8 fired together. That's a lot of lead. It is not, on paper, enough to kill a destroyer. The target that day has been identified as the TA-27, a former Italian torpedo boat that the Germans seized after Italy's armistice in 1943. Sources conflict on exact displacement. Some list her around 800 tons, others closer to 1,000. Either way, she qualified as a destroyer-type vessel in German service, armed, crewed, and operational in the northern Adriatic. She sat in Trieste Harbor, which by mid-1944 functioned as a German naval facility, supporting operations along the Dalmatian coast. Allied air operations targeted that harbor regularly. The 332nd drew the assignment. If you've never heard this story before, you're not alone. And that's part of why this channel exists. Hit subscribe so you catch the rest of this series. Drop a like if you want more episodes built on original documents instead of the same 10 stories everyone already knows. And if you think I've got the ship identification wrong, or you've seen a different after-action report, put it in the comments. Corrections make better scripts. The sinking is hard to explain from a naval standpoint. 50 caliber rounds can penetrate light armor at close range. The standard armor-piercing incendiary round could punch through about 3/4 of an inch of homogeneous steel plate at 300 yards. A torpedo boat's superstructure, her deck plating, her ventilation trunks and exhaust stacks, none of that runs 3/4 of an inch thick. The hull below the waterline is a different matter entirely. You can riddle a ship's topside, kill her crew, start fires in her upper works, and she'll still float. To sink her, water has to get in below the waterline, or fires have to reach magazines or fuel bunkers. Machine gun bullets strafing from above follow a shallow angle. They don't naturally find the waterline. So the question isn't whether 50 caliber rounds could damage the ship. Of course they could. The question is how the damage became fatal. How strafing runs, plural, because the pilots made multiple passes through anti-aircraft fire, put enough hurt into that vessel to send her under. The mechanics of that kill involve angle of attack, target geometry, the specific vulnerabilities of a seized Italian-built hull that the Germans hadn't exactly lavished maintenance on, and the volume of fire that 8 Brownings per aircraft can concentrate into a very small area when the pilot knows what he's doing. The 332nd's pilots knew what they were doing. That's the part the Army Air Forces had trouble admitting in 1944, and it's the part the German sailors in Trieste Harbor learned at close range. A Thunderbolt doing 300 miles per hour at mast height, all 8 guns firing, sounds like a buzzsaw tearing through sheet metal. The men on that destroyer's deck heard it repeatedly. Each pass lasted seconds. Each pass walked hundreds of rounds across the ship from bow to stern. The vessel burned. She settled into the harbor. She went under. No bomb rack, no torpedo, no skip bombing run. just concentrated machine gun fire, delivered by pilots who'd been told, repeatedly, institutionally, by their own country, that they couldn't fly, couldn't fight, couldn't hold steady under fire. The Kriegsmarine lost a warship to men the American military establishment had tried to wash out before they ever reached a cockpit. The irony writes itself. The engineering behind how it actually worked takes a bit more unpacking. September 8, 1943. The Italian armistice hit the Kriegsmarine like a supply closet falling open. One day, Italy's navy belonged to an ally. The next, it belonged to whoever could grab it first. The Germans grabbed fast. Across every port from Genoa to Taranto to the northern Adriatic, German troops seized Italian warships at gunpoint, sometimes with crews still aboard, sometimes after brief firefights that left bullet holes in bulkheads nobody bothered to patch. The haul included cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats, submarines, and a grab bag of smaller craft in varying states of repair. The Kriegsmarine redesignated them with the prefix TA, Torpedo Boot Ausland, foreign torpedo boat, and pressed them into service with German crews who'd never trained on Italian machinery, reading Italian gauges, feeding Italian boilers, and cursing Italian engineering in a language the ship's instruction plates didn't speak. The TA-27 had started life as the Turbine, an Aquila-class destroyer laid down in 1925 and launched in 1927. By the time the Germans took her, she carried 17 years of hard Mediterranean service in her hull plating. The Regia Marina had not exactly prioritized her upkeep during the latter years of the war, when fuel shortages kept most Italian surface combatants tied to their piers rusting in place. The Germans inherited a vessel that functioned, technically, but functioned the way a car with 200,000 miles on it functions. Everything works until something doesn't, and you never know which thing will go first. Trieste in mid-1944 smelled like bunker fuel and hot metal. The harbor sat at the northeastern tip of the Adriatic, backed against limestone hills that trapped the summer heat over the waterfront, and turned the anchorage into a steel oven by midday. German naval personnel worked the docks in shifts, loading ammunition and supplies onto convoy escorts, tasked with keeping the Dalmatian coastal routes open. Partisan activity along the Yugoslav coast had turned every supply run into a shooting affair, and the TA boats drew the thankless job of shepherding cargo vessels through waters where mines, British MTBs, and Tito's improvised navy all competed to kill them. The Adriatic, by this point in the war, functioned as a backwater, too small for fleet engagements, too contested for safe passage, and too politically complicated for anyone at OKW to think about very hard. The vessels assigned there reflected that priority. Germany's best ships fought in the Atlantic and the North Sea. The Adriatic got the leftovers, the seized prizes, the foreign-built hulls with mismatched spare parts, and crews learning their ships by trial and error. A German naval assessment from the period, cited in post-war Allied intelligence summaries, described Adriatic convoy operations as sustainable only under conditions of local air superiority. Local air superiority over the Adriatic in June of 1944 belonged to the 15th Air Force and its associated fighter groups, operating from a constellation of airfields across southern Italy. The Germans knew this. They ran convoys anyway, because the alternative meant abandoning the entire Dalmatian garrison to starvation and partisan encirclement. The TA-27's armor tells the story of her vulnerability. Italian torpedo boats of the Aquila class carried hull plating between 8 and 12 millimeters thick along the sides, roughly a third to a half-inch of steel. Deck plating ran thinner. The superstructure used even lighter gauge material, barely enough to stop shrapnel from near-miss bombs. These ships had never been designed to absorb direct hits from anything. Their survival doctrine rested on speed and maneuverability. Get out of the way, don't get hit, use your torpedoes at range and run. Tied to a pier in Trieste harbor, the TA-27 had no speed and no maneuverability. She sat there like a tin can on a fence post, but the men aboard her, and the officers who'd assigned her berth, operated under an assumption so deeply embedded in naval thinking that nobody questioned it. Machine guns could not sink warships, strafe a ship, and you'd kill exposed crew, wreck topside equipment, maybe start a fire if you hit something flammable. You would not put her on the bottom. That required bombs, 500-pounders minimum, ideally 1,000-pounders delivered from medium altitude, or torpedoes, or mines. The kinetic energy in a 50-caliber bullet simply could not breach a hull below the waterline at any angle a strafing aircraft could achieve. The math supported this. A 50-caliber API round carries about 13,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. A 500-pound bomb delivers roughly 250 million foot-pounds on detonation. The comparison isn't close. It's not in the same universe. German anti-aircraft doctrine aboard these vessels prioritized defense against bomb-carrying medium aircraft, B-25s, A-20s, the twin-engine types that carried ordnance heavy enough to matter. Single-engine fighters strafing with machine guns ranked as a harassment problem, not a sinking threat. Kill some sailors, force damage control, delay the convoy schedule. Annoying, not fatal. The TA-27's crew prepared for the wrong kind of attack. The math didn't support it, until you ran different math. Every gunnery manual in the Army Air Forces listed the M2 Browning's penetration figures the same way. At 200 yards, the standard M8 armor-piercing incendiary round punched through 9/10 of an inch of face-hardened homogeneous steel plate. At 100 yards, slightly more. At point-blank range, which for a strafing P-47 meant the last fraction of a second before the pilot hauled back on the stick, the round could defeat a full inch. The TA-27's hull plating ran 8 to 12 millimeters. Convert that, roughly a third to a half inch. Her deck plating ran thinner still. Every square foot of that ship above the waterline fell within the M2's penetration envelope, and most of it fell well within. The rounds wouldn't just hit the steel. They'd go through it, tumble on the other side, and keep going. Through cable runs, through steam lines, through fuel piping, through whoever stood in the way. One gun firing at 800 rounds per minute puts 13 rounds downrange per second. A P-47D carried 8 of those guns. That's roughly 106 rounds per second, leaving the wing roots, converging on a point the pilot had set during harmonization, typically 300 yards forward of the aircraft. The standard combat burst lasted between 2 and 3 seconds. Call it 2 seconds for conservative arithmetic. 2 seconds of trigger time delivered approximately 212 rounds at the target. Each API round weighed about 1.7 ounces. 212 of them totaled roughly 22.5 pounds of hardened steel and incendiary filling, arriving in a space smaller than a tennis court in under 2 seconds. That's one airplane, one pass, one burst. The Army Air Force's Proving Ground Command at Eglin Field ran extensive tests on 50-caliber strafing effectiveness against ground and naval targets throughout 1943 and 1944. Technical Report number 47-11, dated March 1944, evaluated the destructive potential of concentrated 50-caliber fire against ship-type structures. The report's language stays clinical, as testing documents do, but one passage stands out. The cumulative effect of multiple API impacts on light naval plating produces structural failure beyond the individual penetration capability of any single round. Their phrase, cumulative effect, not one bullet sinking a ship. Hundreds of bullets turning a plate of steel into something closer to a colander, each hole weakening the metal around it, each incendiary charge starting a small fire that found fuel or paint, or cordite or bedding, or any of the 1,000 flammable things packed inside a warship's skin. Now multiply. A standard fighter flight in the 332nd put 4 P-47s on a target. 4 aircraft, each carrying roughly 2,400 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition, distributed across 8 guns. That's 9,600 rounds per flight. If each aircraft made 3 passes and fired a 2-second burst per pass, the flight delivered approximately 2,500 rounds into the target across the engagement. Total weight of projectiles on target, roughly 265 pounds of armor-piercing incendiary steel. For comparison, the German 3.7 centimeter flak gun, the standard medium anti-aircraft weapon, also used in naval surface engagements, fired a projectile weighing about 1.4 pounds at a cyclic rate of around 160 rounds per minute. In a sustained 2-minute engagement, that gun put roughly 448 pounds of steel on target. The 4 Thunderbolts, in their combined 18 seconds of actual trigger time, delivered over half that weight, and every single round carried an incendiary charge designed to start fires inside whatever it penetrated. The flak gun's rounds did not. The incendiary component matters more than the kinetic punch. An API round that passes through deck plating and lodges in a compartment below doesn't just make a hole, it burns at approximately 1500 degrees Fahrenheit for a fraction of a second, long enough to ignite hydraulic fluid, paint, oil-soaked rags, wooden damage control shoring, mattresses and crew berthing, anything organic within a few inches of the impact point. One ignition source is a nuisance. Damage control handles it. 50 ignition sources spread across a 100-meter vessel in the space of 6 seconds overwhelm any damage control party ever organized aboard a torpedo boat. The crew can't move fast enough. They're fighting individual fires, while new ones start behind them, above them, in compartments they haven't reached yet. A ship doesn't sink from fire alone, but fire drives crew away from damage control stations, detonates ready service ammunition in exposed mounts, reaches fuel bunkers or boiler rooms, and produces explosions that open the hull to the sea. The bullets create the holes. The incendiary compound turns those holes into something worse. Dozens of ignition points scattered across a 100-meter vessel, generating the conditions under which a 1,000-ton warship becomes a sinking wreck. The progression takes minutes, not hours, and it starts with a 2-second trigger pull from an aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour, flown by a pilot the United States government almost didn't bother to train. Cited one destroyer-type vessel in Trieste harbor. The mission report from the 332nd Fighter Group, June 25, 1944, logs the contact with the flat cadence of men who wrote these things every day. Armed reconnaissance, Adriatic coast, weather clear, target of opportunity identified. The language carries no excitement because excitement didn't belong in official paperwork. What happened next did not fit neatly into paperwork either. The flight had launched from Ramatelli Airfield that morning, a dirt strip on Italy's Adriatic coast, Foggia province, close enough to the water that pilots taking off to the east could see the sea before they finished their climb out. Armed reconnaissance missions followed a standard pattern. Fly a prescribed route along the enemy coastline or over enemy-held territory, hit whatever presented itself, come home, file the report. No specific target assignment, no bomb load. The P-47s carried full ammunition, 2,400 rounds per aircraft, all 50 caliber API and API tracer mix, and full internal fuel. The mission profile called for medium-altitude transit north along the Adriatic, then a descent to low altitude for the reconnaissance sweep along the Istrian Peninsula and the approaches to Trieste. Trieste sat at the top of the Adriatic, like a cork in a bottle. The harbor opened south-southwest, backed by the city and the karst plateau rising behind it. German flak positions dotted the waterfront and the hills above, 20mm and 37mm guns primarily, with heavier 88mm batteries positioned to cover the outer approaches. Allied intelligence briefings before Adriatic missions listed Trieste as moderately defended, which in practice meant you'd get shot at from multiple directions the moment you dropped below 5,000 feet. The flak map for the region, updated weekly by 15th Air Force Intelligence, showed enough red dots around Trieste harbor to make any pilot pay attention during the pre-mission briefing. The flight leader. Sources don't consistently identify which pilot led this particular element, and the mission reports from that date list multiple flights operating in the same general area, spotted the TA-27 alongside a pier on the harbor's eastern side. From altitude, a destroyer-type vessel reads as a gray sliver against darker water, distinguishable from merchantmen by its narrower beam and the angular geometry of gun tubs and torpedo mounts breaking the deck line. At low altitude, closing fast, it becomes unmistakable. The bow flare, the raked funnel, a warship, sitting still. The flight rolled in. German gunners aboard the TA-27 and on the shore batteries around the harbor opened fire as the Thunderbolts descended through the flak envelope. 20mm tracers rise in what pilots described as a garden hose effect, a visible stream of bright rounds arcing upward, seemingly slow at first, then whipping past the canopy fast enough to flinch. The 37mm stuff comes in clusters, puffs of black smoke that appear ahead of the aircraft and behind it, the gunners bracketing, adjusting. A P-47 at 300 miles per hour crosses a defended harbor in seconds. The gunners get one chance to solve the lead angle before the aircraft is past them and banking for another run. Then they get another chance, then another. Each pass gives the flak crews a better read on the approach vector, and each pass forces the pilot to fly through air that's progressively more saturated with steel fragments. The Thunderbolt absorbed punishment the way Republic Aviation had designed it to. The airframe carried armor plate behind the pilot's seat, an armored windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could take 20mm hits and keep flying. Pilots in the 332nd reported bringing P-47s home with dozens of holes in the wings and fuselage, damage that would have killed a P-39 or a Spitfire. The aircraft's radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, presented a circular profile to ground fire that scattered fragments around the cylinder heads rather than concentrating them into a liquid-cooled engine's vulnerable coolant lines. You could lose a cylinder or two and still make it back to Ramitelli. Lose a cylinder or two, and you could still complete your strafing run first. The pilots made multiple passes. Each run followed the same geometry, a diving approach from the ship's beam or quarter, all 8 guns firing as the Pipper tracked across the vessel's length, a hard pull-up at mast height, trailing cordite smoke and spent brass casings that rattled through the belly of the fuselage. The vibration of 8 Brownings firing simultaneously shook the entire airframe. Pilots compared it to driving a truck over railroad ties at highway speed. The noise inside the cockpit disappeared into engine roar and the hammering of the guns, but on the receiving end, aboard the TA-27, each pass delivered a sound that German veterans of the Eastern Front would have recognized from encounters with Soviet Sturmovix. A ripping, tearing, metallic shriek that lasted 2 seconds and left holes in everything it touched. The flak kept firing between passes. The pilots kept coming back. Trieste Harbor, 12 minutes into the engagement. The TA-27's foredeck looked like someone had taken a rivet gun to it from the inside out. API rounds punching through the deck plating at shallow angles left exit wounds on the underside. Petals of curled steel, each one rimmed with scorch marks where the incendiary compound had burned itself out against the metal. Topside, the entry holes appeared almost surgical, small, clean, regularly spaced where the gun convergence pattern had walked across the ship's length. Below decks, nothing about it looked surgical. The first fires started in the ready service ammunition lockers near the forward gun mount. API rounds that penetrated the thin splinter shields around the mount found stacked 20mm magazines and belted ammunition stored in open racks for fast reloading. Standard practice aboard every small combatant in every navy, because you can't fight an air attack if your gunners have to run below for ammunition. The incendiary fill in the 50 caliber rounds ignited propellant in at least 2 magazines within the first 3 passes. Damage control parties moved forward. Then rounds from the next pass struck amidships, near the engine room ventilation intakes, and the fires there pulled the damage control teams in 2 directions at once. Heat radiating off the TA-27's superstructure distorted the air above her in visible waves. German sailors working the aft flak mount, a twin 20mm installation that required exposed crewmen to load, aim, and fire, kept shooting between strafing runs, feeding fresh drums onto guns whose barrels had begun to glow dull red from sustained fire. The shore batteries continued engaging, but the Thunderbolts' approach vectors used the ship itself as a screen on the pullout, forcing the hillside gunners to hold fire or risk hitting their own vessel, a problem nobody had briefed them on, because nobody had expected 4 fighters with nothing but machine guns to press an attack this long against a defended harbor installation. The fuel bunkers sat low in the hull, below the waterline, theoretically safe from strafing. Theoretically. But fuel piping ran upward to the boiler rooms, and the boiler room ventilation trunks opened onto the weather deck through gratings that offered no resistance whatsoever to a 50 caliber round descending at a 15-degree angle. An API round entering a ventilation trunk travels downward through sheet metal ducting until it hits something solid. In a boiler room, something solid includes pressurized steam lines, fuel oil service tanks, and the boiler casing itself. The damage assessment compiled after the war, drawn from Kriegsmarine records captured at Flensburg and cross-referenced in Allied naval intelligence summaries, noted that the vessel suffered catastrophic fire originating in the machinery spaces, consistent with fuel oil ignition. Consistent with the clinical language of men reconstructing a disaster from wreckage and survivor accounts, trying to explain how machine gun fire accomplished what their training told them required a bomb. So what did the crew do? Trained sailors fought the ship. Pumps ran. Fire hoses came out. Men worked to isolate flooded compartments and contain what they could. The TA-27 carried a complement of roughly 200 men, and those men ran toward the fires because that's what damage control doctrine demanded. But the fires kept multiplying. Every strafing pass delivered new ignition sources into new compartments, and the structural integrity of the hull plating degraded with each burst, not from one catastrophic hole, but from dozens of small ones, each one admitting seawater when the ship settled even slightly by the head or stern. The cumulative effect that the Eglin Field report had described in antiseptic technical language played out in real time aboard a real ship crewed by real men who could smell burning fuel oil and hear the steel groaning around them. The ammunition cook-off came next. Ready service rounds in the aft mount detonated in a chain that blew the splinter shield outward and killed or wounded the gun crew. Secondary explosions followed as fire reached stored torpedo warheads. The ship carried 4 533mm torpedo tubes, and while sources conflict on whether all torpedoes remained aboard during the harbor layover, at least some of the warheads detonated. The blast opened the hull below the waterline on the starboard side. The TA-27 began settling by the stern. Smoke rose high enough over Trieste harbor to be visible from 20 miles south along the Istrian coast. The Thunderbolts pulled off target, formed up, and turned south for Ramitelli. Behind them, German harbor craft and tugs moved toward the burning vessel in a rescue effort that arrived too late to matter. The fires burned through the afternoon. The ship settled onto the harbor floor, with her superstructure still above water, gutted, black with soot, listing to starboard. The Kriegsmarine struck her from the active roster. She never moved again. 4 P-47s, 8 guns each. 32. Browning M2s firing standard-issue ammunition that cost the United States government roughly 6 cents per round. The total expenditure of ammunition across the engagement probably ran under $500 at 1944 prices. The ship they sank had cost the Italian government millions of lire to build, and the German government considerable effort to crew, arm, maintain, and supply. The exchange rate, measured in dollars per ton of enemy warship destroyed, ranked among the most efficient kill ratios of the entire Mediterranean air war. A torpedo boat destroyer does not belong on the bottom of a harbor because of machine guns. That sentence contains every assumption the Kriegsmarine held about air defense, naval architecture, and the hierarchy of threats at sea, and every one of those assumptions burned with the TA-27 on the afternoon of June 25, 1944. The wreck sat in shallow water alongside the eastern pier, canted 11 degrees to starboard, stern submerged to the aft deckhouse, bow still above the surface, at an angle that made her look like she'd tried to climb out of the harbor and given up. Smoke continued rising from the superstructure well into the evening. The fires below decks fed on fuel oil that seeped from ruptured bunker lines and pooled in compartments where the water hadn't reached yet. A slow, greasy combustion that produced columns of black smoke visible against the limestone cliffs behind Trieste, long after the Thunderbolts had landed back at Ramitelli, shut down their engines, and walked to the debriefing tent. Harbor workers attempting salvage the following morning reported that the steel around the machinery spaces remained too hot to touch. 20 hours after the attack, the paint on the hull had blistered and peeled in sheets, exposing bare metal underneath that had oxidized to a mottled brown-orange. The smell, diesel fuel, scorched paint, burned rubber from electrical insulation, and something worse underneath all of it, hung over the eastern basin for days. Dock workers tied rags across their faces. The Kriegsmarine posted guards around the wreck, less to protect a military asset than to keep civilians from seeing what 4 fighters with machine guns had done to a German warship in a German-held port in broad daylight. The operational report filed by the German Naval Command Adriatic, Kommandierender Admiral Adria, listed the cause of loss with characteristic brevity: Tieffliegerangriff, low-level aircraft attack. The report noted fighter-type aircraft, multiple passes, no bombs observed. That last detail mattered to the staff officers reading it in Kiel and Berlin because it broke the expected pattern. Kriegsmarine doctrine classified air threats to surface vessels in a clear hierarchy. Level bombers at altitude posed the greatest theoretical danger but hit almost nothing. Dive bombers represented a serious precision threat. Torpedo bombers could sink capital ships. Fighters strafing with machine guns harassed crews, damaged topside equipment, killed exposed personnel, and that ended the list. Fighters with guns alone did not sink destroyers. The doctrine said so. The TA-27 disagreed. A post-war assessment compiled for Allied naval intelligence, drawing on captured Kriegsmarine operational records and interrogations of German naval officers conducted at facilities, including Flensburg, and later at processing centers in the British and American zones, addressed the broader pattern of losses to fighter strafing in the Mediterranean and Adriatic theaters. The assessment noted that German naval commanders consistently underestimated the destructive capacity of concentrated heavy machine gun fire against lightly armored vessels, and that defensive preparations aboard torpedo boats and escort vessels reflected an assumption that strafing attacks would produce personnel casualties and superficial topside damage rather than catastrophic structural and systems failure. The document uses the word catastrophic, their word, not mine, applied to a loss they spent the rest of the war failing to prevent. The Kriegsmarine's response to the TA-27's destruction followed the standard bureaucratic procedure for absorbing an inconvenient data point. Additional flak weapons arrived at Adriatic ports. Standing orders directed small combatants to avoid daylight harbor stays when possible, to disperse into coves and inlets along the Dalmatian coast, to use camouflage netting. Reasonable measures. None of them addressed the core problem, which had nothing to do with harbor defense and everything to do with the fact that an American single-engine fighter carried more instantaneous firepower than most patrol vessels could absorb. Moving the ship or hiding the ship didn't help, because you cannot make the hull thicker than a .50 caliber round can penetrate. The vulnerability traveled with the vessel. Back at Ramitelli, the mission report went into the filing system. 4 pilots debriefed, listed their ammunition expenditure, noted the target destroyed, ate dinner. The 332nd Fighter Group's operations log for June 1944 records dozens of missions, strafing runs against rail targets, bridges, motor transport, radar installations, barges, locomotives. The TA-27 appears as one line item among many. No ceremony accompanied the sinking of a German destroyer by men the Army Air Forces had grudgingly trained, stationed at a dirt airfield in southern Italy, flying missions that 15th Air Force headquarters classified as secondary to the strategic bombing campaign. The pilots had done precisely what their training and their aircraft equipped them to do. They found a target, applied firepower, destroyed it. The fact that the target outweighed their 4 aircraft, combined by a factor of 10, didn't enter the calculation at the time. It entered the historical record later, when people started asking how a machine gun sinks a warship. The answer had been sitting in the Eglin Field test reports all along: cumulative effect. The Kriegsmarine just never read them. Karl Dönitz signed the order to seize the Italian fleet on the afternoon of September 8, 1943, and in doing so, built the perfect target set for an enemy he hadn't considered. The Kriegsmarine grabbed every hull afloat in Italian ports: destroyers, torpedo boats, corvettes, submarines, harbor craft, because Germany needed ships and Italy had just stopped being an ally. Every kind of logic demanded it. The hulls existed, the crews could be found, the Adriatic needed patrolling, and the war wasn't going to wait. Nobody in Kiel asked whether those Italian-built vessels could survive the specific threat environment they'd operate in 9 months later. Nobody asked because the question didn't make sense under existing doctrine. A destroyer is a destroyer. You crew it, you arm it, you put it to sea. The question should have been, can this ship take a hit from above? The Navigatory-class hull that became the TA-27 had entered service in 1929. Italian naval architects of that era designed for speed and offensive punch in the confined waters of the Mediterranean, high power-to-weight ratios, heavy torpedo armament, thin hull plating that saved displacement and bought knots. The Regia Marina expected its destroyers to fight other destroyers in surface engagements at night, launch torpedoes at superior forces, and run. Air attack ranked low on the threat matrix in 1929. By 1944, that design philosophy had produced a fleet of vessels optimized for a war that no longer existed, crewed by Germans who inherited the structural compromises without inheriting the tactical context that had justified them. Germany seized those ships to strengthen its position. Those ships became demonstration models for American firepower instead. The R-2800 Double Wasp at full military power produced a sound that carried across water for miles, a deep, sustained throbbing roar that resonated in the chest cavity before the brain registered it as an aircraft engine. 2,000 horsepower turning a 13-foot propeller through sea-level air generated a pressure wave you felt in your teeth. 4 of them approaching an echelon, descending through 2,000 feet with throttles firewalled, produced a wall of noise that obliterated speech, thought, and for a few critical seconds aboard the TA-27, the ability of gun crews to hear their officers' commands. Then the guns opened up, and the engine noise became irrelevant because something worse replaced it. The convergence zone. Every P-47 in the 332nd had its guns harmonized to converge at a specific range, typically 300 yards, adjusted by the group armorer based on mission profile and pilot preference. At convergence, all 8 streams of 50 caliber fire crossed through a volume of space roughly the size of a dining room table. Everything inside that volume ceased to exist in its previous form. Steel plate buckled and aluminum shredded, wood splintered into kindling. Human tissue. The after-action reports don't dwell on this, and neither will I, except to note that the TA-27's casualty figures tell their own story. The convergence zone moved across the ship's deck at 300 miles per hour, and where it passed, the ship stopped functioning. You want to know what the math proved? Here it is. 4 aircraft, 32 guns, a combined cyclic rate of roughly 25,000 rounds per minute at the trigger. A 2-second burst from one aircraft put approximately 260 rounds into and around the target. 4 aircraft making, conservatively, 4 passes each delivered over 4,000 rounds into a vessel 600 feet long and 40 feet wide. Most rounds missed or failed to penetrate, but enough API rounds found enough thin plating, enough ammunition storage, enough fuel piping, enough ventilation trunking to turn a functioning warship into a burning wreck in under 15 minutes. The Eglin Field reports had predicted it. The gunnery manuals had dismissed it. The TA-27 settled the argument at the bottom of Trieste harbor. The men who settled it flew for a unit that the Army Air Forces had created under pressure, trained with reluctance, and stationed in a secondary theater flying secondary missions. The 332nd Fighter Group existed because Black Americans demanded the right to fight, and because the Roosevelt administration needed their votes more than it needed the comfort of generals who preferred a segregated force. Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama turned out pilots who met the same standards as every other Army Air Forces graduate, because the standards didn't care about the politics, and neither did the Browning M2. The gun fired for whoever pulled the trigger. The P-47 flew for whoever sat in the seat, and the TA-27 sank because the pilots who pressed the attack through flak held their nerve when a less determined flight would have turned back. Germany seized a fleet to control the Adriatic. The United States trained pilots it tried not to train. One of those decisions produced a target. The other produced the men who destroyed it. The Kriegsmarine's operational files record the loss. The 332nd's mission log records the kill. Between those two documents sits the entire weight of what happened at Trieste. A destroyer sunk by bullets, by pilots who weren't supposed to exist, flying an aircraft that doctrine said couldn't do what it did. By 1900 hours on June 25, 1944, the mission report had already been typed, signed, and filed. 4 sorties, 1 destroyer-type vessel destroyed, all aircraft returned. The form didn't have a box for things that shouldn't have worked. It had boxes for ordnance expended, time over target, weather conditions, and enemy opposition encountered. The pilots filled in the boxes. The operations clerk stapled the pages together. The war continued the next morning. The 332nd flew again on June 26th, strafing missions against rail lines south of Bologna. Then again on the 27th, motor transport along the Adriatic coastal road, a few barges, a radar site that turned out to be abandoned. The TA-27 appeared in no subsequent briefing, no group memorandum, no special commendation from 15th Air Force headquarters. The kill simply entered the statistical record alongside hundreds of other targets destroyed by a unit that flew 1,578 combat missions between June 1943 and the end of the war. 1,578. The number does its own talking. Every mission was logged, every claim cross-referenced against reconnaissance photography and intelligence reports, with the same procedures applied to every other fighter group in the Mediterranean theater. The 332nd's claims survived that scrutiny at rates consistent with or above theater averages. Not because anyone adjusted the standards, because the pilots met them. The Kriegsmarine never adapted to what happened at Trieste. Adaptation requires time and resources, plus an institutional willingness to accept that your threat model contains a hole large enough to sink a ship through. Germany in the summer of 1944 had none of those things in surplus. The remaining TA-series vessels in the Adriatic received minor upgrades, additional 20mm flak guns bolted onto platforms that weren't designed to carry them, which raised the center of gravity and degraded seakeeping in rough weather, a fix that created a new problem. Several of those ships went on to strike mines, get caught by Royal Navy destroyers, or simply run out of fuel as supply lines collapsed. The TA-27's sister ships died in a dozen different ways across the last year of the war, and not one of them died of old age. The thin-skinned Italian hulls that Donitz had seized to project power became, in aggregate, a net drain on German resources, consuming fuel, ammunition, crew replacements, and dockyard hours that the Reich could not spare in exchange for a few convoy escorts and coastal patrols that delayed nothing and prevented less. An entire fleet acquisition program that functioned, in retrospect, as a logistics subsidy for the Allied target list. The Eglin Field test data, meanwhile, traveled forward through the American system exactly the way institutional knowledge is supposed to move, and almost never does. Strafing doctrine in the Mediterranean and European theaters incorporated the cumulative effect model for attacks on light naval vessels, rail equipment, and parked aircraft. Pilots received updated convergence recommendations, and armorers adjusted harmonization patterns to match. The 50 caliber API round, already the standard belt component, gained emphasis in loading schedules for maritime strike missions. None of this happened because of the TA-27 specifically. It happened because the TA-27 confirmed what the test reports had measured, and the field results had demonstrated across dozens of engagements. One data point among many, slotting into a body of evidence that American 50 caliber firepower, applied with concentration and persistence, could destroy targets far above its supposed weight class. The system worked, slowly, imperfectly, with the usual bureaucratic friction, but it worked. The wreck of the TA-27 sat in Trieste harbor through the rest of the war. Yugoslav partisans liberated the city on May 1, 1945, followed by New Zealand troops 2 days later, and the competing occupation forces found the harbor cluttered with sunken and damaged vessels, German, Italian, civilian. Salvage crews cut up the TA-27 for scrap in 1946 or 47. The records on the exact date are thin. She went into a furnace and came out as rebar or sheet stock or something equally unremarkable. her hull plating with its dozens of neat 50 caliber entry holes melted down and poured into molds for a country trying to rebuild itself. Back at Ramitelli, on the evening of June 25th, the 4 pilots who'd sunk a destroyer ate powdered eggs and canned meat in a mess tent on a dirt airfield in Puglia. They flew again the next day. The mission report, the one that started all of this, sat in a filing cabinet, one sheet of paper among thousands, recording in carbon copy typescript that 4 P-47s had destroyed a destroyer-type vessel using only their guns. Nothing in the bomb racks, nothing on the wing pylons, just Brownings. The Army Air Forces had spent 3 years arguing about whether black pilots could fly combat aircraft. The TA-27 spent 15 minutes learning that they could.